This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
I want to welcome you to a very special edition of Real Talk. It's a Friday, which means we present our Real Talk Roundtable. But, sometimes we'll wax poetic about something whimsical. Sometimes we'll have some fun with items in the news, or maybe items, stories that people just aren't talking about. Not today. Today, we're talking about the issue that Canadians say is the single most important issue facing the almost 40 million people that live in this country, and that is access to housing, affordable housing. There's a supply gap. There's a real deficit in availability. Younger generations are wondering, will they ever have an opportunity to own a home? We've asked three of the foremost experts across the country to join us today, and as we told you yesterday, this is the A-list. These are the first three people that we asked, and in 30 seconds, you're going to meet Jennifer Keesmaat, Marie-Josée Houle, and Jeromy Farkas. We'll properly introduce them and then essentially give them the floor as we attempt to solve over the next hour or so Canada's housing crisis. But first, this episode of Real Talk is presented by our friends at Rello, who want to remind you that back-to-school season isn't just for the kids. If you've been feeling stuck or unsatisfied in your job, now is the perfect time to go back to school for a new career. You can launch a rewarding career in real estate with Rello's affordable online courses. These courses make it easy to pass your exam and get your real estate license so you can run your own business, set your own hours, and be your own boss. The earning potential is unlimited. Plus, you'll be helping people every single day as they buy or sell their homes. One of the best things about Rello is how committed they are to your success. They have live instructors who host online exam prep sessions every Saturday, plus a whole bunch of resources to help you launch your real estate business well after you've passed the exam and gotten licensed. Now, here's a special offer for Real Talkers. Right now, you can save 20% on any Rello course with the code REALTALK. All one word, that's Real Talk. You can get started today with that promo code at rello.ca.
I feel like we should have done this show around Halloween. It's so scary.
Hey, before we get into this, you sent me a note at about 6 in the morning today, and I don't know if you were having a hard time sleeping or not, but
I was.
You and I were talking about this episode yesterday in preparation.
With Mo Amir.
Talking about the three candidates that were going to join us. Mo Amir joined us from Vancouver. Obviously, the city of Vancouver's got its own housing issues when it comes to availability and inventory and affordability and all that kind of stuff. Were you tossing and turning last night, Johnny?
I was, because I'm in this boat. I mean, you're a homeowner, I'm not, but me and my partner, we're just about, we're almost there. We're almost ready
You're
to buy.
Aspiring homeowners.
Yeah, but I think Mo touched on this yesterday. It's crazy because everyone's in this one group, right? Wanting to buy a home, can't afford it, bring the prices down. But then immediately when you purchase a home, you jump into the other group. You don't want the prices to come down. And Mo Amir was saying, even if there's a 10%, correction in the market, people are still going to be angry. But 10%, I mean, if you look at home prices here in Edmonton, that's not going to bring things back to when they were affordable. It needs to be 20, 25, 30, which we know isn't going to happen. So it's a very scary time. And as Mo said, it's not just a politician that can make a decision and fix this. It's a complicated, multi-level thing that is just, it's really scary.
And we don't want to oversimplify either, right?
No,
like this isn't all just about bringing prices down.
No.
And then you've got people with their nest eggs going, well, wait a second, what the hell are you doing there?
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of angles we're going to hit this from, which is why we've put together the trio that we have for today. And quite frankly, we're thrilled that all three of them have agreed to join us. Jennifer Keesmaat is the founder of Markee Developments. She's the former chief planner for the city of Toronto. She's a distinguished visitor in planning emeritus at the University of Toronto. And she's just announced, along with several other, can I say, heavy hitters across the country, her partnership and participation in the Clean Economy Fund. And we're going to get to that in just a second. Jeromy Farkas, well known in the province of Alberta, a former Conservative organizer and Calgary City Councillor. He placed second. He won the silver medal in Calgary's most recent municipal election. He was looking for gold, though. He served for 4 years on the Calgary Housing Company's board of directors, and he's also, earlier this year, just completed a remarkable 25 Peaks in 25 days charity challenge, raising more than $50,000 for the Alex, which is a nonprofit housing provider serving the chronically homeless in Calgary. It's also our pleasure to welcome to the program Canada's federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. To the three of you, thank you so much for making time for us today. I want to encourage you to treat this like we're all out for coffees, and feel free to interject, jump in on one another, add your thoughts, take the conversation in whichever direction you think would be most productive. Marie-Josée, welcome to the program. Thank you for making time for us. Why don't you get our audience up to speed on what your mandate is? What does the federal housing advocate do?
Well, first of all, the federal housing advocate is a brand new position. So I'm the first in Canada and probably the first in the world. And my job is to hold governments in Canada accountable to their human rights obligation around the human right to housing, which has been enshrined in local law in 2019 through the National Housing Strategy Act. So the role is nonpartisan, and it is really a monitoring mechanism. It is a watchdog. I can't sue governments. The right isn't enshrined in a constitution, but it is still enshrined in local law. So we look at systemic housing issues. So really it's about the failures and the actions of government to act around the human right to housing.
Jennifer, when we're talking about the housing crisis in Canada, you may have people in one circumstance where, there would be first-time home buyers, and all of a sudden they're getting a sense of what the challenge looks like when it comes to getting their first set of keys. And then you'll talk to others that'll say, we've seen this coming for decades. I would suspect that the former chief planner for the city of Toronto has had this on her radar for quite some time.
Well, hey, look, it's one of the reasons I became a developer. When I was at the city and we were struggling, we were doing our part as a municipality, putting enabling policies in place. We did a whole series of mass rezonings, but the housing wasn't getting built. And at one point, the mayor at that time was John Tory. John Tory said to me, hey, what else can we possibly do? Like, the housing just isn't getting built. And I looked at him and I said, well, there isn't, we don't have the partner on the other side of the table to get that housing built. And so I've been seeing this issue become more and more pressing and critical. We were calling it a crisis 5 years ago, but we never could have imagined that what's happened today could have possibly happened. Like, it's like a crisis on top of a crisis. So I became a developer precisely because I had a pretty good understanding by looking at the data of where this was going and the fact that we need a new approach, and that we need to be focusing on building at scale rather than just building a little bit of housing. To give you an example, our building boom actually happened in the 1970s when our country was a fraction of the size that it is now. And to meet our housing need, as stated by CMHC, 3.2 million homes by 2030, we would need to build more than double the number of homes we built in our highest city building period, which was back in the 70s. We're nowhere near that number right now. So the gap is just kind of astronomical. So it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting and big thinkers and policymakers from all levels of government to start to get into this and to figure out how to fix it. Removing the GST is a really critical start.
I'm really looking forward to talking about what the relationship needs to look like between governments and developers. And this isn't necessarily an exercise in finger pointing and assigning blame, but we do today want to identify what some of the root causes of this issue are and what some of the potential solutions are as well. Jeromy, you wanted to be mayor of the city of Calgary. You're well familiar with that city's politics and with the landscape, economic, political, and otherwise in our home province, and certainly in the province of Alberta that has defined itself as one with healthy population growth, bullish economic projections. But still, this isn't just Vancouver and Toronto we're talking about. Calgary's got its own issues. I mean, the current council right now is hearing from dozens and dozens of people as part of kind of a town hall hearing. What's drawn you to focus so heavily on housing right now with your own career pursuits?
Well, it's affordability, right? And nowhere is affordability more acute than in Calgary, right? We've sort of rested on our laurels for so long with the status of Canada's most affordable city, with high wages, high vacancy rates, low cost of living, and all of the rest. And the numbers are really shocking here in Calgary specifically. I'll give you a couple. So the average rent between 2020 and 2023 increased by about 40%, or more than $600. The vacancy rate fell from about 6% to about 2% over that same time. The median price of a single detached home has gone up about 40%, or nearly $200,000. And at this point in time today, 1 in 5 households in Calgary cannot afford their current housing, and many are still really desperate in their search to find housing. So it's a very acute issue, but it's also a live issue and a real wet clay moments, because today a council committee is debating a suite of about 60 different affordable housing actions. And I think none of it, I wouldn't say the entire suite is great or perfect, but it's a good start. There's a lot in there to unpack, but I think it also shows a little bit of shift of mentality, right? We've had a lot of finger pointing between provincial governments, federal governments, municipal governments. Hey, the province isn't paying enough, or the feds say, hey, that's not our primary responsibility, or the municipalities say, hey, we only have property tax as a lever to work with. But I think here in Calgary, what we're seeing is potentially, depending on the vote and whether or not that strategy is amended or watered down. But I think what we're seeing here today in terms of what's on the table is a made in Calgary solution that really boldly says that, it doesn't matter whose responsibility it is, but here in this city, we're going to decide that somebody somewhere needs to be the first mover. It can be us, it should be us, and it's going to be us.
Marie-Josée, for the benefit of people that'll hear this on the podcast, I'll let them know that you are enthusiastically nodding your head as Jeromy's talking. And in particular, I noticed it as he said, a made in Calgary solution. But hang on a second. Do we need a made in North Vancouver solution, and a made in Calgary solution, and a made in Thunder Bay solution? Or is this a made in Ottawa solution? I take a look at a recent editorial that you penned in the Toronto Star. People can check it out. The headline reads, "Prioritizing people over profit is the way forward on the housing crisis." And you say that the road to get there is the feds investing in non-market housing. Whose lap does this fall into?
Well, this falls in everyone's lap. The complication of the housing crisis is that it's multi-jurisdictional, not just around the municipal, provincial, territorial, and federal levels, but also Indigenous governments as well. I mean, the country is very vast, and we need a national strategy. And I say national because people move in this country, and I've worked on the ground in housing and homelessness for almost 20 years. I've worked as a developer as well in nonprofits and housing co-ops. And I see when people have an ounce of hope, they will move from one city to another. They'll leave everything behind. So, and my family did it too. We moved from Northern Quebec when I was 4 years old to Edmonton, and because of economic reasons. And so people do that, and they do that all the time. But where they land, they can't be victims of their own success. So, but that being said, I really agree with Jeromy. It needs to be, it needs to reflect the local efforts, because it's the people on the ground, and it's usually municipal governments that are closest to the issues. So you need federal leadership federal involvement, federal programs, federal dollars, also matched by provincial government. And then the province is responsible for the Residential Tenancies Act. So, how is the landlord-tenant relationship defined? And we need a standard relationship, or to standardize that relationship so that it's not different for people the minute they cross a bridge, for example, with Ottawa to Gatineau. And because, again, people are looking for places where they will be successful, not just survive, but thrive. So I agree with all of it, but we do need federal leadership on this. And I think, one of the biggest downfalls and how we got here, if we want to explore that, is that the federal government got out of the housing game in the 90s. And, and that was a big mistake. So we're seeing the federal government being re-involved since 2015, 2017, the National Housing Strategy, and then the National Housing Strategy Act of 2019. But these things take time. And then I can point to the past 30 years for in general across the country, but if you're Indigenous, that failure has been existing for at least a century. So the country's big. We need local involvement to reflect, the local needs. And so, Jeromy, though, I'm really excited to ask you this question, if I may. You
Please
say
do.
Yeah, sure.
1 in 5 people in Calgary are experiencing housing precarity, and it's around mostly affordability. Are these homeowners or are these people that rent?
It's both, right? Regardless, you're paying somebody's mortgage somewhere, unless you're one of the few that own the house outright, and you have a landlord who doesn't have sort of those cost increases. But I would say that for a long time we've sort of rested on our laurels. We've assumed that Calgary will continue to sort of sprawl in the fashion that it has. We've assumed that we can keep services high and taxes low, but it's all sort of, everything's come to roost simultaneously. But there's a lot of exciting things that I think Calgary is trying to do that is specific, as you mentioned, sort of to the Calgary context, right? So not every municipality is made the same in terms of what, say, provincial authorities have been delegated to them. Not everyone has the same fiscal capacity in terms of, say, residential versus commercial tax base. But as mentioned, right, it's every order of government needs to pull in the same direction simultaneously. And there's also I think that there's a lot of help, I think, coming from some of the soul searching that's happening right now in the conservative movement, right? I think seeing Pierre Poilievre and the federal conservatives really take the ball on housing and really run with it and push it so hard, I think has really helped give, say, some cover to traditionally conservative city councillors who might be willing to go up to bat and say, hey, we need to look at some of the exclusionary zoning policies that we've had, or say we need to look at things like, say, for me personally, I think, say, eliminating parking minimums is too much. But on the other hand, right, if we are thinking more about where cars will sleep than where human beings will, I think we're in really big trouble, which is why it's sort of cynical to say never waste a crisis, but we're in a real wet clay moment where things can happen that could never happen otherwise, and they can happen faster because of the issue that we're in. But I think regardless of provincial, federal, or municipal politics, if your voters cannot afford a roof over their heads, that is not going to bode well for any incumbent, right? So you have to have a plan. So it's a matter of just, what are you going to do on this, rather than are you going to do anything?
Jennifer, you see this obviously based on your career experience from a number of different angles. What do you make of what we're talking about to this point?
Well, it's kind of funny. Change happens when you start to reach that point of political alignment across the spectrum. And I thought it was wonderful yesterday that the conservative leader was saying they stole my ideas. And it was wonderful for two reasons, because he wasn't saying for removing the GST is a bad idea. He was actually saying, oh, we think this needs to happen as well. So all of a sudden, you've got both sides of the political spectrum arguing for the same solutions. And that can be a very powerful place for advancing change. And by the way, the GST, the Liberals were slow to implement it, but it was in their 2015 campaign platform. There's a lot of good things that from 2015 just haven't happened. And now I think because of that political alignment across the political perspective, they've kind of got some motivation, quite frankly, to be acting on things that may have seemed controversial in the past. There's also, I appreciate the comment from Jeromy about the made in Calgary solution, but the truth is almost all these solutions that are being advanced are exactly the same in cities across Canada. If you look at the, ending exclusionary zoning, we did that. We did that in Toronto about a year ago. Victoria did it a little bit before we did. Edmonton did it a little earlier than that. Now Calgary, as of last night, is doing the same thing, as is London, so a lot of these solutions actually, we have broken frameworks both on the planning side and the delivery side across the country. And so the solutions that we need are kind of pretty similar everywhere. It's a national problem, and the way we're going to solve it is by taking some of these very big ideas that are going to drive supply and start solving them everywhere as well. So we have a labor shortage. We have a really high cost of construction. That is another really big thing that we need to tackle. The solution for that is going to be pretty much the same, whether you're in Calgary or whether you're in Toronto. We need to be building up skilled trades. We need to be focusing on panelization, and to a certain extent, the way using modules can deliver housing more quickly. So, I actually think the fact that we're now having a national conversation about these issues is critical because, look, the beginning of my career, we used to point to Vancouver and we used to say, how do people live there? It's so expensive.
Yeah.
And honestly, now you say that about places like Guelph, Ontario and Regina, right? With what we used to only say about Vancouver, it has become excessively expensive to access housing in this country everywhere, which is kind of a clue that we have a national problem.
I would just jump in briefly and say that the legislation is so different, and sometimes it's not always obvious. So, for example, in Ontario, secondary suites were allowed provincially by the government many years ago by right. Whereas myself, as a city councillor in 2018, we were debating individual granny suites. We would actually spend 2 hours of the city council meeting. An applicant would come in and say they would like their grandmother to live in the basement. We would look, I'm not even exaggerating, the city council, all 15 of us, for a city of 1.5 million people, we would be debating for 2 hours the individual secondary suites.
Hey, I think I mocked you for that. I think I put out a tweet mocking you guys. So,
so it's interesting just to see how the legislation is so different from province to province, because we like to think of cities as sort of the creature of the province, but I would prefer to say we're the first order, we're really where the rubber hits the road with some of these opportunities and potentials. And as well as some of the fundamentals are different, right? With Calgary struggling with, say, 20-30% office commercial vacancy, right? The opportunities and challenges are different at the municipal level. And I'm not going to say what works in Calgary won't work in Toronto or vice versa, but it is very good, as Ryan, you alluded to before, that there seems to be a broader sort of cross-partisan consensus for action of some kind of type.
And I need to jump in here too to talk about how people living in Calgary have different expectations of when they're compared to people who are living in Toronto around what kind of housing they want and they need and why they are in these particular cities. And then there's the mid-sized cities and the smaller cities. We're seeing a crisis in rural areas as well. And in northern regions. So, this is not just a big city or huge metropolis, Vancouver, Toronto versus everybody else. But, I think you said it, the flavor, the expectations of people around what they should get for housing, what they can get for the price, but also for the opportunities that each municipality presents. These are all things that people are considering when they want to set down roots. We're talking about setting down roots. We're talking about home ownership. I think we also need to talk about the rental space. Because if we're talking about the crisis, people who have mortgages pay themselves. And one day those payments will stop. If you're renting, the payments, you're paying someone else's mortgage. And, it is not, it's 1/3 of the population in Canada who rent, but they're the ones who are hurt the most and have the least amount of protections around housing precarity. So, every time we talk about affordability in Canada around housing, somehow that conversation always goes to home ownership. And the latter model, the expectation that everyone should be able to buy a house. Does everyone want to buy a house? First of all, and should that be a single detached home in an urban setting? We know that in Toronto, Vancouver, that's pretty impossible these days. And is that the expectation? And I think, always framing housing policy in that latter model is a huge mistake. There is 1/3 of the population that will always need rentals. That is where we've got a lot of lack of supply. So when we talk about the supply issue, absolutely we need more supply in Canada. We need supply everywhere, but we need the right kind of supply. And $800,000 homes at Edmonton and Calgary prices, which would translate to about $2 million if you're in Toronto or Vancouver, is not the right kind of supply.
I was looking at, Marie-Josée. Jennifer, let me just say real quick here. I wanted to pop this in. We when we announced the three of you joining us this morning, we were flooded with emails, and I've printed off about 10 of them. And I'm going to try to get to as many as I can, and I want to honor these people's time. But like Allison, for example, and Jennifer will hand you the conch in just a second. But Allison says, she says, I think it's important. She says, I know that a lot of people are going to be asking, for example, instead of focusing on the question of how much do home prices need to drop, she says it's important to focus instead on CMHC affordability thresholds, that no more than 30% of gross income before taxes be spent on housing. She says, obviously, a lot of people would be exceeding this right now. Housing affordability obviously depends on one's income. What's affordable for one person, not affordable for another. Using the metric to guide these discussions, that means, for example, a $500,000 home, and people in Vancouver and Toronto are snickering at that, but a $500,000 home would be affordable, she says, to purchase for a household earning about $150,000 a year. For a rental scenario, a rental rate of $2,000 a month would be so-called affordable for a household earning $80,000 a year. So the question should be, how do we incent the construction of differently priced units to meet the needs of various incomes and work toward what Allison says should be the ultimate goal, where nobody is spending in excess of 30% of their gross income on housing? Jennifer, what do you make of that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that when I'm talking about housing in this conversation, I'm actually talking about rental housing. And because we have a lot of preconceived ideas of what a home is, often people think we're talking about a house with a picket fence and a 3-car garage. When I'm talking about a home, I'm actually talking about, for those who can see this, a home is what you see in the backdrop here. These are high quality rental homes, 30% of which are affordable in perpetuity. That doesn't get more stable. You can raise your family, you can retire in old age in a neighborhood, in a community within walking distance to transit, a grocery store, a daycare, a coffee shop in the heart of the community. And that's a home. And I think from a human rights perspective, that's a home. And that's our development, by the way. That's our Tyndale Green development, where we're building
I look forward to seeing it.
1,500 new homes in a walkable community where we've prioritized affordable housing, because I think this gets back to a problem that we have in our mind right now, and we somehow have to detach this, is the difference between something that is a financial tool versus what's a home. A place where you sit at the kitchen table and you do homework with your kids, where your family drops by. That's a home. A financial tool that is going to serve you in retirement is actually something different. And we've actually mixed those things up. And when you mix those things up, then you end up in this problem where, to get to your question, yeah, you're never going to have homes that are 30% of the average income, because those two things go in conflict. If housing is a financial tool, by definition, it is going to be unaffordable for the majority of the population, because that's how people make money on their housing,
right,
is by it being a financial tool. So if we separate those things and we say, wait a minute, we got all mixed up here. Housing should be a home. And where we want people to have the choice to live in the type of housing that is going to meet their needs. And I think we've mixed up what will meet our needs. We think meeting our needs is about a financial investment. And we really have to separate those things out. For most Canadians, living in a high quality, stable rental building that is linked to their income. So, I'm accepting here housing that has crazy rent increases, which is not the majority of housing in Canada, by the way. There's a lot of housing that is actually rent controlled. That is actually going to be financially a better option than investing in the housing market today. The housing market today is very wonky. With the changes in interest rates, for a lot of people, this is one of the reasons you have 1 in 5 people in Calgary right now who can't afford their home. It's because the amount of money they're paying on interest. They're not actually generating any kind of equity. They're paying so much money on interest on a loan for that home. So we've got to disavow this myth that housing is always a good financial tool. And look, it was a great financial tool for my parents. They bought a home in 1970. It was also the year that I was born. At that time, the home cost $42,000. It was a 3-bedroom family home. It cost $42,000 for them to buy. And my dad's salary as a blue collar worker was $24,000. So the home was double his income, right? Today, the average home is more than 14 times the average income in both Vancouver and Toronto. So this idea that a home is always going to be a nest egg for everyone, that may have been true in the past. It's not going to be true in the future. And that's why thinking about building really high quality rental housing that is a good home that people can afford, that's how you're going to get, to come back to your question, to the 30% of income. It's going to be through high quality rental housing that has some kind of rent control. We've self-imposed rent control in our community. We're doing that because we want to create communities. We're not trying to create a financial asset. We're trying to create a community where people can be safely housed and stably housed in a community where they can thrive. And if the math works with getting the development built, then you don't need to be raising the rent at astronomical rates in perpetuity. You don't need to do that.
That's
here. Sorry. First of all, the rent control is, a lot of the provinces in Canada have rent control. However, they don't have vacancy control. And this is usually where we're seeing the rents increase at astronomical rates, is when someone moves out. And the process of getting someone to move out, there's been a lot of abuse in that, in rent evictions, or, citing people to get out because you want to use the unit for yourself or for your family, or bullying or illegal evictions. And I saw a lot of that on the ground when I was doing housing loss prevention. That's an aside, however. Jennifer, I'm really interested in how you're going to do this affordability for a broad spectrum of people. And it's amazing that your organization is doing this, but there's a whole lot of organizations that are trying to profit at all costs. And so what we do need is standard regulations around all of this, that it can't just sit on the goodwill of organizations, because that's what governments do. Governments need to have regulations so that they set the framework in the same way that they set human right to housing as a framework. And this is new in Canada, and I'm glad that this is part of your organization's values. And this is such an amazing start. And I think a lot of organizations they want to do this. They need to learn how to make it work. But what do we do with the organizations that are profiting at all costs? And
you're right, it's regulation.
Everybody.
It's regulation. I agree with everything that you just said. And I think the problem right now is that we have an unregulated housing environment, and it's compromising affordability. It's compromising access to housing. I agree with everything that you just said.
Jeromy, I want to ask you if and maybe I'm just coming into this at like an elementary school level of political analysis, but I wonder if the conservative in you, Jeromy, bristles a little bit at all this talk of government getting involved in markets, and I want to get to that with you in just a second. Well, that's Jennifer Keesmaat that you're hearing. That's Marie-Josée Houle and Jeromy Farkas, our guests on a rapidly progressing Real Talk Roundtable. I wish I had these three for 3 hours, but we don't. We're back to them in less than 2 minutes. Right now, I wanted to let you know that this conversation doesn't happen without partners like our friends at Athabasca University. It's Canada's open university, and whether you're catching this conversation from the West Coast, the East Coast, or somewhere in between, Athabasca University, chances are, is going to be a great fit for you if you're looking to advance your post-secondary goals, maybe prepare yourself for a new opportunity in the job market. Their world-class accredited online programs and courses offer you the flexibility to learn at your own pace on a schedule that suits your lifestyle. You want to know the coolest part about this? Nearly 90%, 9 out of 10 of Athabasca University graduates say that they're working in a job related to their field of study, and 95% of them, more than 95%, would recommend AU to others. You're not going to get ringing endorsements like that every day. You can get the application process started right now, or just learn more about studying at AU by visiting athabascau.ca. If you're looking for a new career in renewable or sustainable energy, the team at Kubi Energy would love to hear from you. They're currently looking for electricians and apprentices in BC and Alberta, Lethbridge, Calgary, Edmonton, Kamloops, you name it. They're hiring project coordinators, customer service reps, solar sales reps, and installers. This is your chance to work within a dynamic and innovative company that's revolutionizing the renewable energy industry in Canada. You'll also be working alongside dedicated professionals passionate about what they do. You can start that process today. Get in touch with them by visiting kubienergy.ca. The same deal goes with Apex Automation. It's Canada's fastest growing automation firm, and they're looking for professional engineers. That's right. If you're a PEng right now, but where you're working, you're not feeling motivated, you don't feel appreciated, you don't feel stimulated, you know that you have way more to give, but the current situation, it's just not giving you that opportunity. Apex Automation is operating across the Prairie provinces. They're in BC. They're even down in the Lone Star state of Texas, bringing businesses toward a point of better efficiency, maximizing their profits, and rewarding their people. You can check out the careers link today if this has caught your attention and you'd like to join the team at Apex Automation. And before we get back to our Real Talk Roundtable, we want to remind you who built this studio that we're operating out of. It's the team at Complete Care Restoration. If you're considering a renovation or construction project, if all this talk about housing inventory, if all this talk about addressing Canada's housing crisis has you thinking about a conversion of a building, or maybe an entirely new opportunity related to building out a space that you know has a whole lot more to give, if you're in the province of Alberta, you're going to want to check out CompleteCareRestoration.ca. We've worked with them. We're proud to partner with them, and we've seen their professionalism on display. You can find them online under the Sponsors tab on our website. That's the Sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com. We're hanging out with Canada's federal housing advocate. That's Marie-Josée Houle. We're talking to Jennifer Keesmaat, formerly the chief planner of Toronto. She's founder of Markee Developments, and obviously Jeromy Farkas, a familiar name to our Alberta audience as a politician here in the province of Alberta. Jeromy, we got people writing in. I got this interesting email here from Millwoods Jimmy, who says, the Conservatives are talking a lot. Pierre Poilievre is in particular about expanding housing, but I wonder how they can do this, considering a significant portion of their base is the not in my backyard type, and you can take issue with that if you like. He says maybe older, maybe wealthier, but he says, but if you throw out words like 15-minute cities to the Conservative base, they get almost hostile. How is it possible for Pierre Poilievre to promise to get more housing built and keep his base happy at the same time, or is it even possible? What would you say to Millwoods Jimmy?
Well, they're there's no way around it. I think there's a lot of soul searching going on right now. But when you take a look fundamentally in terms of property rights, I think it's a conservative value to say I want to be able to do what I want with my property so long as I'm not infringing on other people's peaceful enjoyment, right? And the fact is that building more homes is the best way to increase affordability, and the way to build more homes is to make it easier and faster to build them. And nothing's going to change unless we build more and we build it faster. And I think Steve LaFleur put it pretty well in that there's sort of two parallel crises happening right now, one of too much government and one of not enough government. So I think the left is going to have to really acknowledge that it's the private sector, it's developers, it's all of the private capital that's going to have to be deployed in almost, I think Mike Moffat says, a wartime type of effort to be able to build the amount that we need. But I think the right is going to have to also accept that we're going to have to see significant increases to the investment in terms of affordable housing stock. And again, unless the market housing stock increases significantly, I think the percentage of people who need affordable housing is just going to increase. But when it comes to regulation, at least in the Calgary context, the kind of housing that people think of when they think of the greatest cities in the world, say row housing, walk-up apartments, and so on, is effectively illegal to build in most of Calgary. And we're preventing developers and landowners from meeting the market demand for this sort of housing. And then just to respond again to the initial comment, in that, it seems to be working for Pierre Poilievre, right? The premise is that you can't do all of these things and keep your base. Well, it looks like at this point, the federal conservatives are 10, 15 points ahead, right? So I wouldn't necessarily agree that it isn't working, and that most conservatives fundamentally do agree in sort of the premise of property rights, all of these things. And it is uncomfortable, but it seems to be working, at least for now.
Jennifer, there's a lot of talk. People will invoke developers, and you could be talking about all kinds of businesses and all types of scenarios. But I think it's fair to say that on one hand, developers can be demonized in conversations about affordable housing or the housing crisis. And on the other hand, if we're going to build 3.5 million units by 2030, we need developers. I'm curious for your insights on this. Maybe the leadoff question might be, what needs to change in the relationship between developers, industry, and government?
Well, I think in part there needs to be a better understanding of what it is that developers do. There's lots of different players that come to the table in a development process. You've got private equity companies that fund development projects. You've got the construction industry. You've got the design industry and the technical expertise, people who have expertise in stormwater management, for example. Then you've got the regulatory players like the province and the municipality. And the developer actually sits at the nexus of all of that and has to bring all of the pieces together in order to execute a development project. Now, this is the great irony. There's, if you look at a typical development, let's take a greenfield development for simplicity. During COVID, when prices were going through the roof, we had a very interesting thing that was happening, which was developers who often spent, maybe let's say they'd spent 5 or 6 years getting their approvals, hiring the construction company, dealing with the high cost of lumber, building the houses. They get the house built. Someone moves into the house. Someone flips that house. This happened a lot in COVID. They lived in the house for a couple of years and they sell it. They make a profit. How do you think that profit compares to the profit of the developer who went through that 5-year process, took on all the risk, and built the housing? The developer's profit is very, very small in comparison to the profit of the flipper, as an example. So I think there's I do think part of why we have a housing crisis in Canada is that we've really demonized an industry that we need. We need the development industry to build housing. I'm not sure who else people expect to build housing, because I will tell you something. Governments don't actually build housing. They don't pick up a hammer and hammer in the nail or hire the drywaller. Governments don't do that. And to be honest, we don't want them to do that. They can't, they struggle even just to contract with developers to build things and to project manage, let alone being the one actually having a construction team that they're responsible for. So developers are at the center of solving this problem. And it's funny because I hear so much about developer profits. And absolutely, Some projects are incredibly profitable and some profits are not. And you can lose your shirt if there's a lot of projects right now coming on market in Toronto where the developers are losing their shirt because guess what happened? Housing prices have gone down by 20% in the past year. So that wasn't the market that they thought they were going to be selling into. So there's a lot of risk involved. If it was easy to develop housing, if there was just this inconceivable astronomical amount of profit at everyone's fingertips, why isn't everyone doing it? Because we know there's an insatiable amount of demand. Well, everyone isn't doing it because it's actually very difficult. It's actually incredibly difficult and involves a tremendous amount of risk. So I think we need to flip the narrative on the development industry. I think we do ourselves a disservice. We need our developers. And by the way, every single not-for-profit unit built in this country over the past 10 years was also built by a private sector developer. Just so you know, a not-for-profit organization, 90% of the time partnered with a for-profit developer who built that home. It was the same drywaller, electrician who does a for-profit unit, does a not-for-profit unit. So we've got to get away from this idea that the people who build housing are bad, because honestly, we need more people building housing. It's a really hard space to be in, given all of the uncertainty that exists right now. If I was smart, I wouldn't be doing development. Like if it was just about making money, I would have bought up single family homes 2 years ago with all of my capital instead of putting it into development projects. It's a way easier way to make a tremendous amount of money. But we need housing supply, and we need to be drawing more players who have the expertise into building housing supply. And until we do that, we're not going to get more housing. So I really think we have a really broken narrative about who developers are and what they do. And look, we've got a massive housing shortage. We need more people in this space, not less.
Jennifer, you have such a beautiful talent of just taking something and using words that people can connect with a concept, and it's amazing. I love it. And I used to work as a developer, and there's a reason why I'm not anymore. It is hard.
It's so hard.
There's so many risks, but we were developing not-for-profit and housing co-ops. And the funding programs for those for that kind of development in Ontario was almost impossible. So, but not all developers are the same, and sometimes developers are also flippers. Especially in the condo construction. So, how do we change that narrative? But again, properly define what is a good developer. What is a developer that nobody should be losing their shirt? But then we're also seeing this crisis and the scandal in Toronto around the green belt.
Ooh.
So yeah. So, again, big country, this very, we're talking about Toronto, which is the center of the universe, and it is an orbit unto itself. And I can't, having lived in Alberta, I don't feel that Toronto and Calgary are the same, but we're still addressing these issues. And how do we define what is appropriate for a developer, what is appropriate for housing ownership or ownership of purpose-built rentals? Because if we're going to talk about Toronto, we should also talk about the the speculation and around the ownership of purpose-built rentals. And most importantly, regardless of what we build, how do we keep it affordable in perpetuity? Because this is what we want. We're looking at the National Housing Strategy. We're looking at GST cuts. That's money that government had other uses for. So how do we best use precious taxpayers' assets, which is money, to build something that benefits everyone and doesn't benefit just a few? Because you're right, we need sectors, we need industry. It is, we've got a supply chain issue still. We're going to have a shortage of labor. We already do. It's the same cranes that we need to build a nonprofit or a purpose-built rental for the private market. But more doesn't automatically mean affordability. So What do we
Absolutely.
need to do
If I,
this?
if I can just jump in just for a second, just a couple of really critical things that I think you've said there. And it goes back to your comment earlier about regulation. This is why this cannot be such an unregulated industry, because it's always a bad thing in a society to assume people will do things out of the goodness of their heart.
Sure.
They won't, right? Every single developer in the city of Toronto that stands up and brags about the affordable housing that they built as part of their condo development, do you know why they built it? Because we made them. We made them in regulation when I was chief planner. And you know what they did? They fought me tooth and nail. They said it would ruin the project. They said it would destroy their pro forma. And guess what? People are living in those affordable units now. So you need to get the regulatory context right. That's absolutely critical. The only way I would say that other places are similar to Toronto. Toronto's a little bit out ahead. We're ahead on the secondary suites. But there's a lot of things that we can do that are the same from one jurisdiction to the next. The other just quick comment I'll make is that, how much money does the government collect on a rental unit, GST, that doesn't get built?
Mm-hmm.
They collect zero. So if we have a policy in place to remove the GST and that enables a developer to build rental housing that wouldn't have gotten built any otherwise, there's no monies that are disappearing from the federal coffers.
Well, in fact, they're gaining money, right, from income
They're gaining
taxes and
money.
all the activity.
Exactly, through a whole series of other taxes. And we've done the analysis somewhere of the amount of money the government gains by forgiving the GST, because on our projects, it actually, on a few of them, as I outlined earlier, it flips them into viability. So, a project that we're not going to build, well, guess what? Now we are going to build it. There's a whole series of other taxes the government's collecting on that. So that's why the GST forgiving is such a powerful public policy. We're not taking, any money out of anywhere. We're not robbing Peter to pay Paul here. We're literally using a forgiveness mechanism to actually generate other revenues for the government and to generate housing.
Jeromy, I want to go to you, but first let me integrate or introduce another email from a real talker. This is from Mr. Dad, who chimed in at talk@ryanjesperson.com, says, to your panel, I'm very disappointed in the choices our elected representatives have been making around densification as a means to achieve affordable housing and sustainable development. Although many Albertans prefer to blame Justin Trudeau, affordable housing issues in the province are almost entirely the jurisdiction of municipalities that are guided by provincial legislation like the Municipal Governance Act. Beyond densification, most new developments do not reflect any of the principles of smart growth or sustainability. A quick lap, here's references to Calgary and Edmonton, around Stony Trail or the Anthony Henday Drive confirms that urban sprawl continues at a shocking pace. Prime agricultural land, green space, we could talk about the green belt, constantly being stripped and paved as generic subdivisions spread out. These new communities often isolated from established public transit corridors, resulting in increased car dependency and traffic congestion. They lack trees, which prevent erosion. They improve air quality, obviously capture carbon, and improve energy efficiency by providing shade. Meanwhile, countless already serviced and conveniently located inner-city grayfield sites sit derelict. Says Mr. Dad, I challenge the legitimacy for all this drama and panic in the first place. A quick search of MLS listings indicates that right now there are more than 500 homes priced under $300,000 in Calgary and thrice that many in Edmonton. Canada was just named the second best country in the world by the U.S. News and World Report's global survey. Housing crisis, says Mr. Dad. What housing crisis? What would you say to him, Jeromy?
Well, tell that to anybody who's getting a $600,000, $800,000 rent increase.
Jennifer's tearing her hair out,
and,
by the way, for the podcast
and
listeners.
the data is there, right? Like CMHC says that we need, I think it's 3.5, even more, perhaps million additional units needed by 2030 to be able to make Canadian housing affordable again. And we see some good steps with, say, the GST rebate, I think, is going to contribute. I think Mike Moffat had estimated between $200,000 and $300,000 or 300,000 additional units, about 10%. To be able to get us there. But this is a difficult issue because it's very anecdotal, right? People contact their councillor based on their own personal experience. And it's almost like an issue that you can't use data to change somebody's mind on a position that they felt their way into, right? But at a minimum, I think when you take a look at the hits that Calgary and Edmonton are going to take if we do not address housing affordability, it's going to be significant. We've rested on our laurels for affordability for so long. And when we think about a global integrated economy, many CEOs or business owners will tell you they'll optimize for quality of life and affordability for their employees, right? So you can't operate in any jurisdiction unless you're able to attract people to live there and to be able to retain that talent, especially when a lot of work can be done remotely, right? So part of it is also the politics, right? I think there's a fear of change here in Calgary in the Herald, our main newspaper. There's actually an opinion editorial that suggested if we make minor increases to density, that is going to put our way of life at risk. The kids literally won't be able to go walk down the street to go get ice cream at the local shop and stuff like that. And for me, especially as a former conservative city hall politician, I heard a lot of that, and I sort of fell into the trap of thinking of property taxes as the way to keep life affordable, right? Okay, so if only I could solve for property taxes, then I'm doing my job. Then you have to consider it's only maybe 3/4 fewer who actually pay property taxes. And if I'm solving for giving you, say, $10 less on your property tax bill, but I'm making you have an additional car, or I'm raising your transit bus pass by another 15 or 30 or $50 a month, that's not actually saving affordability, period. So I think the challenge has been on people like me and other fiscal conservatives to say, all right, we can't talk about taxes. We need to talk about holistically affordability. It's mobility, it's transportation, it's housing, it's fees, it's all of this together. And the fundamentals are there. We cannot continue as we have previously. There's a fun, I think, Venn diagram I saw on Twitter in terms of high quality services, low density, and low taxes. And you can't have all three simultaneously, right? So I think that we can responsibly increase development. I think we can have better expectations of our developers, but ultimately we're not going to be able to build the amount that we need unless we have that wartime effort, that we deploy all the capital possible. And, I'm going to call out our city council here. And I'll say,